Sugarcane started as a garden-grown treat, but soon became an economic force. The rising demand for sugar drove European colonization of the New World, spurred the rise of slavery, and led to brutal revolutions and wars. In 2021, sugarcane was the top crop worldwide, producing 1.86 billion metric tons, followed by maize at 1.21 billion metric tons. Sugarcane is used for both sugar and ethanol biofuel production. Over 3,000 years, the center of sugarcane cultivation moved from India to Persia, across the Mediterranean to African coastal islands, then to the Americas, and finally to Indonesia. This shift led to the creation of the plantation system, where colonists planted large single-crop areas to ship and sell in Europe. To increase productivity and profits, slaves and indentured servants were brought in to work these labor-intensive farms. Sugarcane was the first crop grown this way, followed by others like coffee, cotton, cocoa, tobacco, tea, rubber, and oil palm. The exact origins of sugarcane cultivation are unclear, but it likely began around 10,000 years ago in New Guinea with the species Saccharum robustum. The innovative agriculturalists of New Guinea also domesticated plants like taro, bananas, yam, and breadfruit. The cultivation of sugarcane moved steadily eastward across the Pacific, reaching the Solomon Islands, New Hebrides, New Caledonia, and Polynesia. It also spread westward into continental Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and northern India. During this spread, noble canes hybridized with a local wild species, producing thinner, less sweet but hardier hybrids that thrived in subtropical regions. For ages, sugarcane was simply chewed for its sweetness. About 3,000 years ago, people in India started squeezing the canes to produce sugar. The Indians kept the sugar-making process a secret, reaping significant trade profits. This changed in 510 BCE, when Darius I of the Persian Achaemenid Empire invaded India, taking the sugar-making technology back to Persia. By the 11th century CE, sugar became a major trade item between the East and Europe. Sugar production continued in Persia under various rulers until the Mongol invasions in the 13th century destroyed the industry. When the Prophet Muhammad initiated his holy war to spread Islam in 632 CE, his followers also sparked an agricultural revolution. During their early Persian invasions, they discovered sugarcane and many other crops unfamiliar to much of the world, such as artichokes, bananas, coconut palms, cotton, eggplants, lemons, limes, mangoes, rice, spinach, sorghum, sour oranges, watermelons, wheat, and yam. This period, known as the Arab Agricultural Revolution, saw Muslim armies introducing these crops to new regions, significantly transforming agriculture throughout the Mediterranean. Sugarcane, referred to as the Persian reed, was introduced to Egypt by the Muslims in 710 CE, becoming the world's most sought-after source of sugar and peaking in production from about 1000 to 1350. From Egypt, Arabs spread sugarcane cultivation westward across northern Africa, reaching Morocco and Spain by the mid-7th century. Morocco saw significant sugar production beginning in the late 800s, peaking from 1000 to 1200. In the Iberian Peninsula, sugar production started around 900, booming from 1300 to 1500 during a period of Muslim control. The Arabs also introduced sugar to Cyprus, Crete, and Sicily by the early 800s. However, significant sugar production on these islands began much later, often after Arab control had waned. Cyprus experienced peak production from 1300 to 1500 under Genoese merchants. Crete saw its sugar boom from 1400 to 1500 under Venetian rule. In Sicily, sugar production flourished from 800 to 1050 under Muslim rule, and again from 1380 to 1520, when the island was effectively under Spanish rule. In the 15th century, the Portuguese seized control of global sugar production, driven by their exploration and colonization of the Atlantic islands along the African coast. This began with the colonization of Madeira, where Prince Henry saw sugar as the key to success for his Atlantic ventures. He imported cane plants and skilled sugar technicians from Sicily, leading to the establishment of the first sugar plantations. These plantations involved clearing large areas of land for farming and building factories for sugar processing. The first sugar was refined in Madeira in 1432, and by 1460, the island had become the world's largest sugar producer. Sugar remained Madeira's main product until the mid-16th century, when it was gradually overtaken by wine production. During the same period, the Portuguese also developed the uninhabited Azores, Cape Verde Islands, and São Tomé, while the Spanish conquered the populated Canary Islands. Sugar production never became significant in the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, but the Spanish Canaries and Portuguese São Tomé became major sugar producers by the late 1400s. From the outset, slave labour was essential to Atlantic sugar production. In the Canaries, the Spanish initially forced the native Guanches to work in the cane fields. However, when disease and overwork decimated the Guanche population, they began importing African slaves to sustain the labour force. In the 16th century, the centre of sugar production shifted to the Spanish-controlled Caribbean, starting in Santo Domingo, then expanding to Cuba and Puerto Rico. Christopher Columbus had introduced sugarcane to the region during his second voyage in 1493. While the Spanish were primarily focused on finding gold and silver, they couldn't ignore the profitability of sugar. In 1515, they imported skilled sugar masters from the Canaries and soon sent their first sugar shipment to Europe. The Portuguese discovered Brazil in 1500 and quickly began planting sugarcane. The first sugar plantation was established in 1518, and by the late 1500s, Brazil had become the main sugar supplier to Europe. Brazilian sugar production peaked in the 1620s in Pernambuco and Bahia, reaching about 15,000, 20,000 tons annually. Upon arriving in Brazil, the Portuguese tried to subjugate the local Tupi people to work in the mines and on sugar plantations. However, the Tupi were not well suited to the sedentary life of farming, were uncooperative as slaves, and were highly susceptible to European diseases. Many also escaped into the dense forests. The Portuguese responded by turning to the African slave trade, a system already in place on their Atlantic sugar plantations. By the mid-16th century, African slaves predominated on Brazilian sugar plantations, although the enslavement of indigenous people continued into the 17th century. Initially, Dutch merchants largely financed the burgeoning Portuguese sugar industry. However, the Dutch eventually established their own colony in northeastern Brazil, becoming active sugar producers from 1630 to 1654 until they were expelled by the Portuguese. The Dutch then redirected their money, expertise, and shipping to the Caribbean, which was being colonized by the British and French. Within 30 years, the Caribbean took over global sugar production, drastically reducing the price of Brazilian sugar by 2/3 and significantly cutting Brazilian exports. The Caribbean sugar industry emerged as a formidable competitor to Brazil, beginning with the small island of Barbados and eventually encompassing a variety of British, French, and Dutch territories. Settled in 1627, Barbados transformed into a vast sugar factory by the 1640s, dominated by a few large plantation owners. Life on the plantations was brutal, plagued by disease and alcohol, but those who survived and thrived accumulated immense wealth, mirroring the opulence of British royalty. By the late 1600s, sugar production had spread to several Caribbean islands, including the British-controlled Antigua and Nevis, the French-controlled Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Dominique, now Haiti, as well as French and British sections of St. Kitts. Dutch merchants grew wealthy by transporting goods to and from these islands. Ultimately, British Jamaica emerged as the crown jewel of Caribbean sugar production, following a prolonged and challenging period of settlement. The peak years of Caribbean sugar production coincided with a turbulent era in European politics, marked by frequent wars among France, England, Spain, and the Netherlands. These conflicts inevitably affected the Caribbean, where the sugar plantations became crucial to the European economy. By the 1700s, sugar had become the most important internationally traded commodity, accounting for 1/3 of the European economy. The British Islands also produced large quantities of rum, widely consumed by British drinkers globally. while the French exported vast amounts of molasses to the British American colonies, where it was distilled into rum and sold across the continent. When the British northern colonies declared independence in 1776, the ensuing war saw Britain fighting on two fronts, North America and the Caribbean. The Caribbean sugar industry was too valuable to be ignored, representing a more significant component of the British economy than the northern colonies. Consequently, Britain maintained a strong military presence in the Caribbean during the Revolutionary War. This focus likely benefited the northern colonists, contributing to their eventual victory and independence. By the 18th century, Saint-Domingue, the French half of Hispaniola, had become the centre of sugar production, boasting thousands of sugar plantations and earning the title of the richest sugar island. However, this prosperity was abruptly disrupted at the century's end when the slaves on the island successfully rebelled, establishing a free nation by defeating the armies of Europe's major powers, first France, then Great Britain. A key leader of this rebellion was Toussaint L'Ouverture, who became the de facto ruler of Saint-Domingue. On January 1, 1804, Saint-Domingue declared its independence and became Haiti, named after the original indigenous Arawak name for Hispaniola. This made Haiti the second nation in the Americas, after the United States, to gain independence from European control. The founding fathers of the United States were deeply concerned about Haiti's independence. They feared that a similar rebellion could erupt among the hundreds of thousands of slaves in the southern US. As a result, the US withheld recognition of Haiti for over 60 years, only formally acknowledging it in 1862, when President Abraham Lincoln did so during the Civil War, just before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Following the Haitian Revolution, many sugar planters fled to Cuba and Louisiana. Cuba soon became the world's leading sugar producer, while Louisiana became the US's sugar bowl. The Caribbean plantation system, heavily reliant on slave labor, was essentially transferred to these new regions where slavery persisted. When the Civil War began, disrupting sugar supplies from Louisiana to the north, Hawaii emerged as the new sugar production center for the US. Though sugarcane had been cultivated in Hawaii by indigenous people long before Captain Cook's discovery of the islands, modern plantations were not established until the mid-1800s. In the mid to late 19th century, numerous other sugar production centres emerged worldwide, including British and Dutch Guiana, now Guyana, East Africa, Mauritius, Natal, in South Africa, and Queensland, Australia. By this time, slavery had been abolished in most parts of the world, and these sugar plantations relied on indentured labourers, primarily from India. Between 1835 and 1917, over 1 million Indian indentured workers were transported to sugar plantations around the globe, 450,000 to Mauritius, 150,000 to East Africa and Natal, and 450,000 to South America and the Caribbean. In the mid-1800s, the Dutch established a massive sugar industry in Java by exploiting the local population. Under a system known as the Cultivation System, the Javanese were compelled to grow sugarcane, deliver it to factories, and then work in these factories. This system was centered around 94 water-powered Dutch sugar factories that processed raw cane into refined sugar. During the 1850s, the Dutch meticulously gathered data on over 10,000 villages and devised a plan identifying catchment areas within a radius of approximately 7 kilometres around each factory. All villages within these areas were reorganised to grow cane. Throughout the system's operation, millions of Javanese were involved in sugar processing and transport, either through forced labour or as free labourers. It's estimated that about a quarter of the population worked in the sugar industry. By the mid-19th century, Java's sugar production was so extensive that it contributed 1/3 of the Dutch government's revenues and accounted for 4% of the Dutch GDP, making Java one of the world's most financially lucrative colonies. In 1870, the agrarian law was passed in the Netherlands, abolishing forced labour and allowing private companies to lease land in sparsely populated areas. This law led to significant investment in larger plantations and expanded cultivation into western Java and Sumatra. The sugar industry was soon joined by coffee, tea, and tobacco plantations. Initially, these plantations were established by private investors, but over time, they were taken over by international corporations. The labor system transitioned from forced family units to indentured servants, mainly illiterate peasants from Java and Singapore. During the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, the naval blockade by the British cut off cane sugar supplies to French-controlled Europe. In response, France turned to the humble beet, already used as food and fodder in Europe, as a new source of sugar. Although beets contained less sugar than cane and the extraction process was more expensive, they became a crucial sugar source during this period. Napoleon ordered the planting of thousands of acres of sugar beets, and by 1814, more than 300 factories were processing beet sugar. However, after Napoleon's empire collapsed at Waterloo and the blockade was lifted, cheaper Caribbean cane sugar regained its dominance in Europe. For several decades, sugar production from beets remained relatively minor. The situation changed when Britain banned slavery in the Caribbean, causing cane sugar prices to rise. By this time, selective breeding had increased the sugar content in beets to levels comparable to cane, and extraction costs had significantly decreased. This put beet sugar on nearly equal footing with cane sugar. By 1854, 11% of the world's sugar came from beets, and by 1899, beet sugar production surpassed cane sugar by 65%. Today, Brazil leads global sugar production, followed by India, the EU, China, Thailand, and the USA. Brazil, India, and Thailand primarily grow sugarcane, while the EU focuses on sugar beets. In the US, about half of the sugar comes from beets, and in China, around 20% is beet sugar. Despite advancements, the labor force in today's cane fields still largely consists of workers brought in from outside the production regions by labor managers. These workers often endure harsh conditions and low wages, with deductions for food, housing, and other necessities often leaving them in debt, mirroring a system that borders on modern-day slavery.